The following program is suitable for general audience of any age. We would like to remind our viewers that the views expressed in this program by our participating guests are solely viewpoints of them who take part and does not reflect the views and beliefs of the Derana Media Network.
Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of Gen XYZ. We're here at Neko and Kopi at Narvala Road, and we have some exciting news about what they have in store for you guys. But before that, we have to address what's at hand today. So today's topic is about the disaster that occurred in Sri Lanka and is actually currently going on around Sri Lanka with the flood situation. And we actually brought in an expert on the topic to talk about the economic aspect and the impact that it has on the country. So this is Mr. Shiran that we have here on to my left, and he is actually a researcher for Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, and he's a political economist and he's also a journalist. Thank you so much for being a part of this show. My first question to you is to just give us a small introduction as to who you are, what you do, and why you do what you do.
Sure. First of all, thanks, Selena, for having me on the show. Right, so yeah, I'm Shiran. I'm a journalist and political economist. So my original training was as a journalist, so very interested in meeting new people, traveling to new places, and just telling interesting stories. I think I've always been curious about how the world works, and being a journalist is a great way to sort of do that. And I think you, being a journalist yourself, just probably, understand what I'm saying. I think from that later took me to economics and political economy, because I think I realized at a certain point in my career that the economic aspect was really important to understand the kind of material foundations of society, the way society is organized so that we can, produce things, and how the wealth is distributed. It tells you a lot about society, yeah? So even, as a journalist, it's important to know those things. I work for an organization called Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. We are, you could call us a think tank. We work very closely with grassroots movements, so social movements, farmers movements, trade unions, even some political parties across the global south, and trying to address the crises that people face at the ground level, working people face in particular, and trying to provide kind of theory and direction to those kinds of movements. Yeah, that's what we do, and I think I'm sort of motivated to do that as well, because it's very rare to find a space to do those sorts of things. All our work is available for free on our website, tricontinental.org.
And it's honestly great, because you mentioned that you were actually not born and bred here in Sri Lanka. So the fact that you came here and you wanted to sort of help out, because you saw the amount of culture and the people here and you wanted to help out. So that's a great initiative on your part. But moving on to my next question. Now, we all know the situation. We've seen it all on the news with the flood situation. A lot of people are affected. More than 400 people have died, unfortunately, in this tragic incident. Now, we understand the deathly impact it has on people, but can we have a sort of like a summary on the impact that it has had as of now on the economy of the country?
Sure. I think needless to say, it's a devastating effect. And the numbers are still being crunched and calculated. I've seen numbers saying as much as maybe 1% of GDP being shaved off by the disaster. But that doesn't really tell you anything. Like, you say that and it sounds impressive, but it doesn't really hit your heart. You look at the fact that about 2/3 of the railway lines are unusable, right? So this is like the arteries of transportation in the country. How many people, you see how packed our railways are in the mornings and in the evenings, people traveling, right? So there's that aspect. And these railways transport goods, not just people. On top of that, you have significant damage to the roads. You've seen many acres of agricultural land that's been damaged. We're in the Maha season, early in the Maha season, so that's our main agricultural season. We depend on the output from that season to feed us for most of the year, particularly paddy. So there's about, I think, 2 lakh or more hectares of paddy that's been damaged. So that probably signals that there will be a food crisis. I've heard reports in some areas because things were not accessible, they couldn't transport food, so you have a sudden increase in food prices. So obviously there'll be some unscrupulous traders who use the situation to hike up the prices in response to sort of the market signals and so on. There's that aspect. There's cattle, another one. I haven't seen any calculations of that, but I was in Puttalam a few days ago, and that area, there's a lot of people who depend on livestock. And as I was following some volunteers doing relief efforts, some of them were telling us that some of the low-lying lands where the livestock graze were basically filled up with water. So it looks like a valley, but it's not a valley, right? And the cattle were there and they drown and they die. In Mana district, they've said to basically stop cattle slaughter because they don't know about disease being spread. I mean, I could probably go on and on, but that would take up the whole show. But there's this a significant impact for sure economically, right? It impacts production in particular, and mobility, people's ability to go in different areas. Of course, the destruction of houses and assets and so on and so forth. But I'll stop there for now.
No, and talking about the livestock, I think there was a news going around that a lot of chicken had died during the floods, and a lot of people were selling them as, and there's a lot of disease that those chickens carry, and like you said, it's obviously going to affect that market as well. But
and there's more health impacts, right? I mean, this is just the initial strike, but after the disaster, during the recovery phase, there's so many dangers that come about. So as the water stagnates, you have mosquito-borne diseases, you have the danger of rat fever. Children are quite vulnerable to these things, without the appropriate medical support and so on.
Yes, and I saw a lot of people actually provide support in that aspect when they were donating to these relief, organizations, giving mosquito nets and everything. People actually thought about that, but the people that are supporting these people, they're going to also hit a wall at one point, right?
Absolutely.
So when that happens, when the support from everybody else sort of stops or maybe stalls, how do we function? How are the people that are vulnerable get out of that? How do they do that?
That's interesting. I mean, I think Sri Lankan society is very admirable in the way it comes together in a time of crisis. We've seen this from, the tsunami and even in the 2016 floods. I think it's partly culturally embedded, there's this sort of Shramadana kind of culture that we have. That's a good thing. There's a vast amount of community mobilization. But it also signals a weakness because, private individuals are compelled to organize themselves to fill in the gap from a fairly weak state and government capacity. Yeah. The thing is, I mean, I've done a little bit of relief work, I've reported on relief work in the past, and it always feels like a drop in the ocean, Like when you read about hundreds of thousands of homes being damaged and you go and clean like 5 in a day, it's a drop in the ocean. State capacity is super important. It's really hard to explain how important it is because the state should play a role in coordinating and centralizing activity in a way that we just can't. Like we can do something at a ground level, maybe in our village or in our district, and we can coordinate like that. But, it's the state that should have the information system and, the local government system to direct supplies here and there. But unfortunately for us, it's been weakened over several, decades. You can call it austerity, meaning, the government is just not funding these things. So, people are taxed, but the government is not really pouring money into social services, into local government. That stuff is weak, and we know we're coming out of the crisis of 2022, the debt default, the IMF program. We've already been hammered with taxes. We know that poverty has doubled since 2019, so we were already in a very weak state capacity. So I spent some time last night just trying to figure out how other countries respond to similar crises, because obviously Sri Lanka is not the only country that gets hit by extreme weather, cyclones, droughts, and so on. One example I found was earlier this year, Typhoon Ragasa, which hit China, Taiwan, Philippines, a couple of places. The Chinese example is super interesting because the Chinese authorities described this as the king of storms. It was actually way more intense than what we experienced through Ditwa. What they did was, through the local governments and through the party cadres, they found the vulnerable villages, identified them, and basically escorted them to pre-made shelters. So about 2 million people were evacuated, right? 2 million. So for reference, in Sri Lanka, I think the amount of people who were affected in total by these, by Ditwa was about 1 million. So just double that amount they managed to evacuate. No one died. There was not a single death, but there was about over $1 billion in property damage. So, the fact that no one died doesn't mean that this was a weak typhoon. It was an extremely strong one, but they managed to save people. And in fact, on Chinese social media, there was little clips of the shelters, and they were really good shelters. I mean, they were stocked with food, the special food for the elderly, special food for pregnant women. There were like ACs, electricity, entertainment. It was, it was just like looking at another planet or something. It's unimaginable, right? Given our situation. But
and considering the fact that he's actually from our region, Southeast Asia, yeah.
Asia. And I mean, we both started our sort of independent development journeys around the same time, right? Late 1940s. But let's put that aside. I mean, China, the scale of that society is different. It's obviously much wealthier than we are at the moment, right? So we can look at countries that have a similar GDP per capita, or even regions. So Cuba, for example, it's a fairly poor country. It has a lot of political issues because there's this huge sanction embargo by the US. So, the US was against the Cuban Revolution, so they didn't want it to flourish as a country. They wanted to maintain control of it. So they have they have difficulty accessing things like medicine, fuel, and so on. Nonetheless, they're prone to these natural disasters. Again, they were hit by a very, very severe cyclone, I think in September, right? And
yes, it was headlining.
And they managed to evacuate 10% of their population. Again, nobody died. But in the same region, in Jamaica, several people died, right? The physical damage to infrastructure in Cuba was very high. A lot of energy infrastructure, electrical grids went down, houses were destroyed, but, bare minimum lives were saved, right? So why was Cuba and China able to do this? And I could add to that even Kerala, which is right next door, right? Kerala also very prone to floods and cyclones. 2018, they had, I think, a once-in-a-century flood. They saved a lot of people's lives. I think the main lesson is that, these countries developed their capacities over time, right? They had very pro-people kind of governance. They very deliberately built up systems, knowing these things happen, and they built up capacities. So, in China's case, they have the luxury of wealth, of industrial power, so they can mobilize a lot of machinery and vehicles and so on. Cuba, Kerala, much poorer, so they depend on the grassroots organizations. The local government has to be strong, the community organizations, your farmers' organizations, women's organizations. Because what you've seen in Sri Lanka also, in some cases, there were people who were warned, but they don't know where to go. Like, just because you tell someone to evacuate, it's not like they're going to do it. Unless you have family or friends in another district, you don't leave the house. Sometimes you don't leave the house because you're scared it's going to get looted or something. So there's a trust issue, lack of trust in governance or lack of trust in society. Those things have to be built over time. And it's really way past time Sri Lanka be looking at those things.
Yeah, and I actually want to get into that whole why these countries are so maybe better at handling these disasters and what we as a country can do to improve and where we're going wrong exactly. And I will head into it right after this short commercial break. You're watching Gen XYZ on Other Derana News Channel. Welcome back to Gen XYZ. We are here at Neko and Kopi in Navila, and they are actually doing some amazing work when it comes to the flood relief. We will talk all about it in the third segment, but we are here with Mr. Shiran, who I explained earlier is a political economist and does his own research and is a journalist as well. Thank you so much once again, Mr. Shiran, for being a part of the show. And we left off from how we are going to compare ourselves compared to other countries and where we are going wrong exactly when it comes to allocating funds to the right places, what we can do to improve. What's your answer to that?
In terms of allocating funds, that's very interesting because the actual space to do that is severely constrained in Sri Lanka. You might already know that the bulk of the money that the government earns and the government spends actually goes for debt repayments, right? So, really most of the public money just goes out to pay back the creditors. Not much of it actually trickles down to the people, to the social services, right? To healthcare, education, all those things that we value and we want to improve upon. That's a significant issue. Sri Lanka is not the only country in that kind of boat. Throughout the global south, what you formerly call the third world or developing countries, this is a major issue, right? Sri Lanka is one of the worst off in the sense that our annual interest payments, right? The interest on the debt, not the debt itself, the interest on the debt is an extremely high proportion of our total economy. That, as I mentioned earlier, really restricts the space that the government has to respond to a crisis like this. So, assuming that the damage is 1% of GDP, right? How with the current constraints are we going to do that? Because there are certain restrictions, for example, with the IMF program that we're in, that we have to meet certain targets. So the government will have to renegotiate those targets. I think the IMF does have a history in the past of adjusting those things when there is a natural disaster like this, because you can't expect to be aiming for a surplus in the government budget when there's a disaster. This is exactly the time where the government has to spend. Even if it runs into a deficit, it really needs to be pouring money to rebuild the economy, to get people back on their feet. I think that's the way forward. But more importantly than the financial thing is, for me, the institutional structure and the state structure. As we were discussing earlier, countries like Cuba, China, even regions like Kerala, they have an institutional structure. So even in a situation when you don't have funds, if you have systems in place, if you have people who are educated, mobilized, committed, to serving the community, you can still do something even if you're in a really poor situation. And in fact, when you don't have access to resources, all you have is that ability to organize yourself.
Which would you say is what's happening right now with the country? I mean, private organizations are sort of stepping in when I think maybe there's no central governance here in Sri Lanka.
Of course, yeah. I think they're doing that. It's very, very important that they are doing that. But it needs to be happening in a lot more of a coordinated way. So what we always see happening is that these disasters strike, and then people organize themselves and do something. But then the organizations that come up in the next few weeks, months, they're going to disappear in a year. They're not going to sustain themselves. So that takes a kind of conscious effort, and it requires also political direction. It requires state direction to keep the organization going. Because it's not like, okay, we get together with a few friends a day and we make some parcels of, dry rations. Let's say we make, 200 parcels and we send it to people. For 200 people get those, it maybe serves them for one day. But then there's the rest of their lives that they have to recover from this disaster.
Because people have lost their entire livelihoods in this disaster.
Absolutely. So making resilient grassroots community organizations is extremely important. Strengthening local governance is extremely important. Why in Sri Lanka did we not have a system where, the disaster management officials and the Department of Meteorology or the central government, why couldn't they centralize the information and disseminate it to the Grama Sevaka level? Why didn't people at the Grama Sevaka level have the trust of the village communities to actually get them out of the houses? Why didn't we have ready-made demarcated areas to escape these things? I think now more than the sort of finger pointing. It's important to start building those structures, because something I haven't mentioned so far is that the elephant in the room is climate change. This is, I think, probably a lot of experts might agree, is a prelude. This is something that's going to be happening more often. And countries like Sri Lanka are extremely vulnerable to it,
With this location.
Exactly. So low-lying coastal communities are vulnerable to rising sea levels. We know that in the central areas, very vulnerable to landslides, very vulnerable to flooding. So with this cyclone, every river system in Sri Lanka, every river basin flooded. That's kind of unprecedented. And the amount of rainfall that fell on Sri Lanka is unprecedented. We should take it as a warning that these things can and will happen in the future. Right? And it is a social crisis that requires a coordinated social response. So the financial aspects aside, I think it's important that really people start looking at how to make long-lasting institutions and community programs to, look after ourselves.
Yeah, and I think there was actually a very insightful sort of looking to how we can maybe go about, and the fact that we need to make these changes now before it's too late and we have to go through this again. And because I think the worst thing is being in a recession, economic recession, and having to then have this on top of that. I think it's the worst thing ever, because we were sort of trying to look up. I think Sri Lanka since 2018, 2019 hasn't been able to look up, maybe in a social aspect and also economically as well. And my next question is actually talking about taking a step away from the maybe political aspect of it, looking a bit at the job market, because currently, if you look at current status quo, a lot of the youth, a lot of us, we are looking for jobs. Sometimes a lot of us don't look for traditional job roles, we look for, convenience and flexibility, but because of this loss, because of this economic loss that's happening right now, I think jobs are going to be harder, even harder to find. What is the impact that this disaster had on the job market?
It's still quite early to, I think,
give an exact figure.
Yeah, give an exact figure and how that will affect things. I think the trend in Sri Lanka since, let's say, the 1970s has been towards migration. Yeah? I personally am also a product of that. My parents migrated out of this country because they couldn't find suitable economic opportunities. I chose to come back because I'm crazy. But that's the trend. We know after the 2022 crisis as well, a lot of people migrated, and through my work and research, I get to travel around a little bit, and it's very striking. I visited an estate in Yatiyantota a couple of weeks ago, and when you talk to the people there, even though it's close to the plantations, most people don't work in the plantation anymore. The men, whenever they can, they migrate. These young men, as soon as they're able-bodied, as soon as they're able to leave school, they migrate to somewhere in the Gulf to get a job. Again, for flood relief work, I was in Puttalam. I came across families where the husband was in Israel, right? Somewhere in the Middle East. So that's a structural feature of the economy. I think and I assume this crisis, the climate crisis, is going to make things worse.
It's going to trigger mass.
Because one of the reasons for migration in the first place was a decline in opportunities and incomes in the rural sector, because the vast majority of Sri Lankans are actually rural, actually agrarian, right? So a lot of young people, even if they get an education, there's really nothing for them to do at the village level or at the town level, because we haven't really built an economic model that pushes industries into those areas, right? So they're compelled to come to the city. But there are not enough opportunities in the city to absorb all of those people, so they end up migrating out of the country. Now, in a crisis like this, when agriculture is affected really badly, right, and you might see, for example, an increase in rural indebtedness, because a lot of people depend on credit, on bank loans to start the farming cycle. Before you plant, you need to borrow money, you need to get the fertilizer, the seeds, so and so. When things are destroyed, then you can't pay back your debt. So that's going to create indebtedness, and then people are compelled, how do you pay that back? Well, what do? You go to Qatar or Dubai or Saudi or Israel or something, right? Take all the risks to leave your family, you earn some money there and remit it back, right?
Yeah, and the pressure is, I think, significantly more on the youth than to sort it out.
Yeah. I was lucky enough to travel out of Sri Lanka a few times this year, and to me, it's like every time I go to the airport, it's kind of heartbreaking because I know I go out, I do my thing, and I come back,
But a lot of
whatever
people
work
can't
related.
afford to do that.
A lot of people can't afford to do that, and every time I'm at the airport, I always see such moving scenes, like very young people, probably in their early 20s. I assume a lot of these people have not even been to Colombo, right? Young people who have just come straight from the village to the airport, right? So they've probably not lived in Colombo. And it's very heartwarming because they've got the phone on, right, on a Zoom call throughout the entire time,
Talking
right
to the
until they
parents.
board. And I kind of eavesdrop in. It's like a little social experiment because you get to know a lot about your country through experience like this, and you see who's on the phone, and it's like they're in a small house and there's like 10-15 people there. Everyone is there to see them off and wish them well. Sometimes they're lucky enough for the whole family to come and drop them at the airport. I'm saying this kind of emotive stuff because you don't really get the impression from numbers. You have
Yes.
to really break it down in that way. So my sense is that a lot of young people are going to be pushed out of the country in search for better opportunities. That leaves behind a lot of older people who then depend on
The labor
remittances.
force changes. I actually want to dive, further into then what kind of industries people should maybe focus more on. Maybe what are the industries that Sri Lanka as a whole can rely on to get us out of this situation. And I actually want to get your personal opinion on what kind of advice you have for the youth as well. But until then, we have to head into a short commercial break. You are watching Gen XYZ on other Derana News channel. Welcome back to Gen XYZ, and we are here at Neko and Kope and Navla Road, and we have some exciting news that's coming right after the end of the segment. But before that, we have to head into conversation with Mr. Shiran. We were talking about what kind of industries can sort of take Sri Lanka out of this recession that's come out of as a result of this disaster, and what industries maybe the youth can sort of go into to ensure a good successful career.
I think for Sri Lanka, my answer to that question would probably be the same answer that I would have given you even before the crisis. In the sense that as a relatively small country that is quite vulnerable to all sorts of external shocks, oil price goes high, we're in trouble, climate shocks, we're in trouble, and so on and so forth. Something that we've always needed to focus on is a little bit of self-reliance, right? And I mean particularly in sectors like food, so in agriculture, in energy, and also in building up our manufacturing capacity. Sri Lanka is not a country that manufactures a lot of things. I mean, we have the apparel industry, it's been there for a long time.
Textile.
Yeah, we export that, but it doesn't provide a dynamic base for Sri Lanka, right? I think in the current situation, it is more urgent than ever to really rehabilitate our rural sector first, right? So a lot of energy, I think, needs to be going to revive agriculture, to modernize agriculture. Cooperatives are a very important mechanism through which we can do that, right? And through community-led efforts. So to really work on our capacity to, at the very least, produce and distribute fairly the food that we need to consume to sustain the population. I think that is, bare minimum. It should have been done yesterday, day before yesterday. And now more urgent than ever given the impact of the cyclone on the agrarian sector.
To make it a self-sustaining country?
Yes.
So that we don't have to import basic necessities.
Exactly. I mean, I like to use the word self-reliant. Some people use the word self-sufficient. Sometimes self-sufficient gives, I think, the wrong impression that we're going to try and produce everything that we consume, which we know is an impracticality given the nature of production in the modern economy, because it's, it's globalized, it's fragmented. There's what you could call a socialization of labor across national boundaries, right? That's a fact. That's a historical trend. I think it'll continue. But even within that, there's always scope to increase your self-reliance, so that we're not so dependent on, all sorts of external shocks. Tourism, for example, right? Always after a crisis, the impulse that we have is to support the tourism sector because we need the foreign currency. But the thing is, tourism is a very vulnerable kind of sector. Right? We saw that with COVID, came to a standstill. Again, now, there's been a massive impact on hotels, on transportation systems. That's going to impact tourism.
Yeah, because a lot of the scenic routes can't be taken now because of...
Absolutely. And like, if you look at the effects of the floods, I mean, it's kind of disastrous. It's not a pretty sight. Some of the places that have been affected, and it's going to take a long time to clean that up for the community, let alone for foreigners to come and enjoy their time here. So, agricultural self-reliance, I think, is very important. Energy as well is, I think, super important, and we need to start moving towards, say, new renewable forms of energy. They call it green energy, new energy, whatever you want to call it. The impact on transformers in the grid during the peak of the storm was massive, right? So, if we have a more resilient system for energy distribution, I think that will go a long way as well. And the final thing, and something that I've always pushed for, is manufacturing and industrialization. And that doesn't mean just having a couple of factories that exports. That means having a kind of diversified industrial base, yeah, where one thing leads to another. So you make one part of a final product, and then you learn to make another part and another part, and before you know it, you have this whole ecosystem of engineers, of technicians, of designers, right, of distributors. We don't really have that kind of dynamic system in Sri Lanka. They've been working on building that in, say, Vietnam, in China. And China is obviously the most famous case of that. We don't really have a local supply chain. I think it's important to people to start thinking of development in that way, because it's not just like you have your isolated business and you make money for yourself and your firm. You need to really make an ecosystem of firms, of different productive capacities that complement each other in a way. And that is really what is behind actually building a modern country.
Yeah, and I wanted to, so you would, like you said, then sort of promote the youth going into industries like this, because it's the best way to take the country out of the place where it is right now and maybe sort of propel us further in the economy. And now, you mentioned how we've obviously suffered natural disasters like this prior, and also we were talking about other countries that have gone through similar things. How did we deal with these disasters when it happened? Maybe the tsunami that happened in 2004, maybe the floods that happened in 2016. How did we fix the economy then, or how did we attempt to do it?
Well, I'm not an expert on disaster management, but to my knowledge, we've never really had a great response mechanism. I mean, to be fair, I don't think it's the worst either.
Did you think the economy recovered to a certain aspect?
I think the economy recovered to a certain aspect, but there are a lot of questions to be asked. Now, the 2016 ones were not as severe as these floods. So let's take the tsunami as an example. Okay, there's a famous author named Naomi Klein who has this book called Disaster Capitalism, and she uses Sri Lanka as an example. The thing is, at a time when communities were vulnerable and a lot of infrastructure had been destroyed, you had this feature of private interest, corporate interest, trying to take advantage of the situation by acquiring land, by acquiring assets, and so on. And you also have a feature where the state or the government is kind of co-opted by some of these large companies and corporations. That is unhealthy, because you could have a recovery in GDP terms. You can grow out of the impact. But the quality of that growth matters. What is the distributional impact of that growth? Sri Lanka is one of those countries where we've had growth after the war, until about, let's say, 2015, 2018, we had growth. But the distributional impact of that growth was not great. India is another example. It's a growing economy, sure, but there's still a huge amount of inequality. There's a lot of people without access to basic resources. That's not a good growth model, right? A good growth model needs to, in my opinion, be a lot more egalitarian, needs to be a lot more inclusive. Whatever profits are made, there needs to be mechanisms by the state to compel investment in social infrastructure, because that's actually more sustainable in the long run. Again, China, Vietnam, growing countries, but there's been a lot of effort to, redistribute the benefits of that growth. So obviously you will have a phase in the growth period where the ceiling increases. People make a lot more money. But then you also need to be looking at the flow.
Price flow,
right?
yeah.
It's not just the ceiling that needs to go up, the flow needs to go up. And if that doesn't happen, that's a path towards social collapse in a way, because people's trust in the system is going to fade.
The corridor needs to be stable.
Exactly. In that sense, the sort of rebuilding Sri Lanka Commission and the composition of it, which is so heavily tilted towards the private corporate sector, to me does not inspire confidence. I think it's all right and even healthy to have private sector participation. You should have someone from the Chamber of Commerce, because they run the big businesses, they know the lay of the land. But these interests are basically driven by profit motive, right? It's the nature of the animal. I'm not making any personal attack. It's just how it is, right? Business is driven by making profit. But you need to balance that with, social need.
So when things like this happen, they have no real incentive to stick around when the
Of
dust
course.
settles. And my next question, which will be my last question, any advice other than what you've talked about the strengths that we can focus on as the Sri Lankan economy, and what sort of industries the youth can go into, and how we can bring our country out of this recession. But any advice you have for the youth on anything related to economy, whether it's the job they choose or something that they will pay the bills with, because right now some people are working 2 to 3 jobs, they're living paycheck to paycheck. How can they increase their quality of life? Is there anything?
How to increase the quality of life? I mean, it's very hard as an individual. I could give the easy example of taking risks and doing entrepreneurship and so on, but the reality is that out of 100 people who try that, maybe half a person actually succeeds. Not everyone can be an entrepreneur. We need to be thinking more socially, right, in terms of how to bring the entire country up, rather than only thinking in terms of pursuing private interests. On the other hand, I would say that a disaster is a very interesting time and a useful time to get to know your society, get to know the length and breadth of it, its strengths and its weaknesses, because a disaster really strips everything bare, right? You see the weaknesses in your infrastructure, in your governance, but then you see the strength and resilience of your communities. I would encourage young people to go out there and get involved in work, and to do it in a way where you kind of study society. I mean, even if you go to a village or a town to assist in relief efforts, you will find that there's differences even in that town, Sometimes if you're in Colombo, you assume everyone in the Gama is poor, but that's not true. There's a differentiation there, right?
Hierarchy.
You will see that there are bigger houses and smaller houses, people who live in one area and not another area. So it's a very interesting way to get to know your society. Get to talk to people while you're engaging in relief work or in distribution, right?
Know what they want.
Exactly. Know what they want, what their interests are, what they do is also very fascinating. What they do, what kind of sectors do they work in, what are their lives like. That's a very good and I think useful opportunity for young people to take advantage of, if I can use that language, at this moment.
Of this situation. And I think we actually gained an insight into what the economy looks like. Because I feel like a lot of people, we're talking about the debt toll, we're talking about the property damage, but we're not really talking about how we can fix this, how we can get out of it. And I think today's conversation sort of will help the youth understand or look my country needs me. It's not just me, but like a lot of people getting together and sort of taking the country out of where it is right now. Thank you so much, Mr. Shiran, for being a part of the show. And we actually need to head into a small segment where we want to talk a bit about the work that Neko and Kopi is doing. So we'll see you. You are here on Gen XYZ, and we're here at Neko and Kopi Navara Road. Now, the interesting thing that I wanted to talk about was the amazing work that they're doing for the victims of the flood. And victims, we're talking about the kittens here. And this little kitty is actually 4 weeks old, and there are multiple other cats there that they're fostering right now until they're ready to be, taken out into the public. So if you can show your support in any way possible, whether it's by coming to the cafe, whether it's by buying these little fellows, food items, hygiene items, whatever it is, please do come and visit and support this great initiative by Neko and Kopi down in Navla Road. But thank you so much for being a part of the show. This is Gen XYZ, and if you want to send in your feedback, you can send in your feedback at feedback.adncenglish@derana.lk or via WhatsApp at 076-805-7933. Thank you so much for watching Gen XYZ. We'll see you next week, same time, same place.
Yeah, I'm out at Brooklyn. Now I'm down in Tribeca, right next to the Narrow. But I'll be hood forever. I'm the new Sinatra. And since I made it here, I can make it anywhere. Yeah, they love me everywhere. I used to cop in Harlem. All of my Dominicanos right there up on Broadway. Pulled me back to that McDonald's. Took it to my stash spot, 560 State Street. Catch me in the kitchen like a Simmons whipping pastry. Cruising down A Street, off-white Lexus. Driving so slow, but BK is from Texas. Me, I'm out that Bed-Stuy, home of that boy Biggie. Now I live on Billboard, and I brought my boys with me. Say what up to Tata, still sipping my top. Sitting courtside, Knicks and Nets give me high five. Nigga, I be spiked out, I could trip a referee. Tell by my attitude that I most definitely from